All right. Well, it's 7 o'clock. I'm sure that there will be other people who will be joining us in just a few minutes, but I want to be sensitive to Rabbi Shapiro's time and the graciousness with which he accepted our invitation. I wanted to start off with just a little bit of an overview, and he can certainly correct me for any the biography or biographic details that I might get incorrect. Rabbi Dr. Marc Shapiro is a graduate. He's a rabbi, he's a professor, and an author of various books and articles on Jewish history, philosophy, theology, and rabbinic literature. And he received his Bachelor of Arts from Brandeis University and his PhD at Harvard University, where, if I understand correctly, he was one of the final student of the great Isidore Twersky. And he also, as I noted, received rabbinical ordination, I believe, from Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt. And currently he's the chair of the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Chair in Judaic Studies at the University of Scranton. And he's written a number of books, one of which I'm reading currently. I'll read these titles to you just very quickly. We'll provide a link to everyone who's here so they can look up the titles on Amazon. But some of these include Between the Yeshiva World and Modern Orthodoxy, the life and works of Rabbi Yehiel Jacob Weinberg, the collected writings of Rabbi Yehiel Jacob Weinberg, Volume 2, 2 volumes, The Limits of Orthodox Theology, Maimonides' 13 Principles Reappraised, one that I wasn't aware of, which is the book titled Saul Lieberman and the Orthodox, Studies in Maimonides and His Interpreters, Changing the Immutable, the one that I'm currently reading, How Orthodox Judaism Rewrites Its History, and Igerot Malcher Rabbanan. And then I think the newest one just came out this year, Renewing the Old, Sanctifying the New, the Unique Vision of Rav Kook. So with that being said, I just wanted to express our gratitude on behalf of Congregation Zohar Yisrael and other individuals who have joined this online presentation, this shiur, for Rabbi Shapiro agreeing to join us and being part of this series of lectures that we have. We're trying to do our best to incorporate in-person and online learning for our growing synagogue. So without any further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Rabbi Marc.
Okay, thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here. And what we're going to talk about tonight is, did the sages always tell the truth, and should we? So I guess I'll speak for 45 minutes approximately, and then we'll have time for some questions. As we're going along, feel free to type questions into the chat bar. At the end, I'll go back and we'll go through that. But I want to begin with a story. Sturgeon, the fish sturgeon, is not eaten today in America by traditional Jews. It does not have the scales that make a fish kosher. Yet this has not always been the case. In the 18th century in Prague, the great rabbi of Prague, his name was Yecheskel Landau. He's known as the Noda Yehuda. He was like the leading halachic authority of his day. He was sent a sturgeon from Hungary. He examined it, and he concluded that it was kosher. And in Prague, they ate it. Just as a side point, not really relevant too much to what we're going to speak about, but just as a historical point, I want to call your attention to something. This here is the list of kosher fish from the 1930s in America by the Agudas Rabbanim, the organization of Orthodox rabbis. And you can see very clearly that sturgeon is on it. And sturgeon was eaten in America as a kosher fish. And in fact, actually, if you look just a little bit below that, you see swordfish also. Swordfish was also eaten as a kosher fish, not only in America, it was eaten even in the state of Israel until the early 70s as a kosher fish. So that's a different issue in and of itself. But let's return to our story. There was a rabbi in a city, Pax, in Hungary, and his name was Grisshaber. And he was very opposed to the consumption of sturgeon. He was convinced that this was a terrible mistake by Rabbi Landau, an absolute violation of Torah law. He had a problem, however, how to get people to listen to him, little Grisshaber, when what he was saying was in opposition to the world's leading halachic authority, Yecheskel Landau. Yecheskel Landau said it's kosher. So Grisshaber came up with a solution. He claimed that Rabbi Landau, who had since passed away, sent him a letter retracting his earlier permission, his earlier approval of sturgeon. Grishaber tells us that he does not have Landau's original letter since he forwarded it to the rabbi whom Landau had given his original decision. That is, this rabbi of Hungary sent the sturgeon to Rabbi Landau. Rabbi Landau sent the answer that it's permissible back to the rabbi of Hungary. Then Grishaber tells us that he wrote to Rabbi Landau. Rabbi Landau wrote to him retracting his permission, and Grishaber sent the retraction to the rabbi of Hungary. That's why he doesn't have the original letter. He also tells us that he misplaced the copy of the letter that Landau wrote to him. Now, needless to say, this is all very fishy. Unfortunately for Grishaber, Landau's son, Rav Shmuel Landau, who was now the head of the Beit Din in Prague, was alive and well, and he wrote to Grishaber telling him that what you say is an absolute lie, and if you continue saying that my father retracted his lenient view, the truth is going to come out and it'll make you look very bad. Now, what's fascinating and what shows the difference between the mentality we're going to see, Rabbi Landau Jr., and the contemporary outlook is how Rabbi Samuel relates to Grishaber. If a contemporary figure were found to have lied in this fashion, as Grishaber did, to have falsified a document, this would obviously be the end of him as having any authority. Even if he didn't actually falsify it, but used a document that he should have known, or at least suspected was false, the consequences will be severe. Think of Dan Rather, if you remember his career and similar situations. One would expect that the same fate would befall a rabbi who publicly made a false attribution, especially in something as significant as Jewish law. Yet this is not what we find. Rabbi Samuel, at the same time that he's writing to Grishaber, telling him that he's lying, also shows him respect. If you know Hebrew, you know that when the rabbis write to one another, they use exalted terms. They write in a very highfalutin fashion with rabbinic titles. He writes with these rabbinic titles at the same time he's telling Grishaber that Grishaber's lying. So what's going on here? The key, I believe, is Rabbi Samuel's comment to Grishaber that although he knows Grishaber is lying, Rabbi Samuel is sure that his intentions are for the sake of heaven. What does this mean? Well, to understand this, we need to look back at the Talmud and some other rabbinic writings where we find some very challenging statements which reflect a completely different understanding of truth, especially truth and attributions that I think most of us are accustomed to in modern times. And the book that the rabbi mentioned, Changing the Immutable, deals with this in detail. And this is a fascinating tradition which has been overshadowed by a different approach. The different approach is the one which also goes back to Talmudic times, and which is very much in line with how we feel today, namely that truth is basically an absolute, with certain rare exceptions that we'll see. I believe that the tradition we're going to speak about now has been overshadowed and indeed covered up for apologetic reasons because it's so out of line with the currently accepted approach. Now, regarding truth and attribution, which is taken very seriously in the Jewish tradition, let me make a few points. First of all, the Talmud says that if you repeat something in someone else's name, it's like you bring redemption to the world. This is based on the fact that Esther repeated, saving Achashverosh's life, she repeated it in the name of Mordechai, and this led to the Jews being saved. The Talmud further states that if you repeat words of Torah in the name of a dead scholar, it says that his lips move in the grave. Citing this passage, that if you repeat something in the name of another scholar, you bring redemption to the world, the 16th century scholar of Levi ibn Habib said that we can conclude from this the reverse is also true, that it's a terrible thing not to cite one source, that is to plagiarize. And in fact, in Tractate Kala is one of these minor tractates, and it's not really a Talmudic tractate, it's like a post-Talmudic tractate, but it still has authority. In Tractate Kala, it says that if you falsely attribute a statement to a great sage, you cause the divine presence to depart from Israel. Now, nothing is unexpected here. These are the sorts of sayings that you would expect in the Talmud. And there are other sayings that speak about the importance of proper attribution and truth in general. So, for instance, Tractate Avot, Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, states the world stands on three things: on justice, on truth, and on peace. In Tractate Shabbat, in the Talmud, it says that the seal of the Holy One must be his truth. But I want to now look at the alternate tradition, which is hardly known, and consider what its implications are. Let me begin by just quoting a few Talmudic passages for you. And it's interesting that although in modern Orthodox literature, they have lots of problems with these passages and try to come up with explanations. If you read the Art Scroll, they include these very clearly, as if it's not a problem. If you look in Tractate Eruvin 51a, the Talmud describes how two sages, Rabbah and Rabbi Yosef, were discussing a halachic matter. And in order that Rav Yosef accept Rabbah's opinion, Rabbah reports that Rav Yossi also shared his opinion. And the Talmud upon this states that this is not correct. He attributed this view that Rav Yossi agrees with him to Rav Yossi, but it's not correct. He only said that so that Rav Joseph would accept it, since Rav Yossi is known as an important sage. So Rabbah says to Rav Yosef that Rav Yossi agrees with me. But the Talmud tells us it's not true, that he made this up. Wow. According to this, if you're sure of a halacha, you can falsely state that a certain great sage decided in this fashion. And this lesson is repeated by one of the Gaonim, who stresses that before doing so, you better be clear that you know what the halacha is. It couldn't be any more clear, I think, that honesty has now been sacrificed, according to this statement, in the name of a larger goal, namely conformity to proper halachic behavior. Now, some of the commentators on this text try to soften it by saying that Rabbah actually heard such a teaching. The falsehood is only in the attribution, but not that Rabbah invented the teaching. So you have two ways of reading this. Either this was Rabbah's teaching, and he attributed it falsely to Rabbi Yossi, or he had actually heard this teaching in the name of another rabbi, or just as a tradition, and the falsehood is only in the attribution. But either way, truthfulness has been sacrificed for a larger goal. We find another example in Tractate Shabbat 114b to 115a, where Rabbah does the same thing. It's talking about there on Yom Kippur, what actions, if Yom Kippur falls out on Shabbat, what can you do in order to have food ready when the fast is over? And they determine that it's only after the time of Mincha, you can prepare the food. Normally, you don't prepare until after Shabbat. But the Talmud tells us that Rabbah's household, they started doing it, preparing things before the proper time. And Rabbah said to them that he received a letter from the west, that is from the land of Israel, in Rabbi Yochanan's name, that this is forbidden. And Rashi explains there that this is not true. He never received such a letter, but he wanted his family to accept his ruling, and they weren't paying so much attention to him. As the New Testament says, there is no prophet in one's hometown. That's actually found in many rabbinic sources, but it's actually a New Testament text. Ein Navi Be'iro. So they weren't listening to Daddy, so he said Rabbi Yochanan also said this. False statement. The same lesson is found in Pesachim 27a, where an explanation of a ruling attributed to Shmuel, the Talmud says that he falsely attributed it to the sages instead of the individual sage who said it. Why would he attribute it to the sages? Because the more the merrier. If you tell people that lots of sages say this, they'll pay more attention to it. And in my book, Changing the Immutable, I cite a number of other examples of this. And the only conclusion you can derive from all these passages is that if you are convinced of the truth of your opinion, you can deceive another to bring them to the truth. So what's going on here? How can we explain that there are great rabbis lying, all in the name of a larger good? And as I said, there's numerous other examples. But whatever happened to basic honesty? I believe what we see in the rabbis, and this is the argument in the book, is that the rabbis in these texts adopt an approach that is really no different or at least very similar to what Plato in the Republic refers to as a noble lie. What's a noble lie? It's a lie for a higher purpose. Now, Plato is speaking of lying in order to preserve the temporal order. Sometimes rulers have to lie in order to keep the people in line, to keep stability. It's a paternalistic approach so that people, for their own benefit, and that of society at large, cannot be let in on all the truths. I think it's clear that the rabbis also have a conception of the noble lie. But unlike Plato, the noble lie is not intended to provide stability in society or anything like that. Its point is much more exalted. It was designed to ensure spiritual values, to ensure that people's lives are conducted in accordance with Jewish law, which is an expression of God's will. In fact, I think it's significant, I mentioned this in the book as well, that it's not only that we have a conception of the noble lie directed to the people, the masses, we even find it occasionally being used when sages address each other. Okay, so that this notion of a noble lie, rabbinic noble lie, raises all sorts of questions in and of itself, which we don't have time to discuss today. The primary one relates, I think, to rabbinic authority. Societies function on the assumption that people tell the truth. If that was not the case, I would have no reason, or none of you would have any reason to assume that what anyone's telling you are truthful in any interaction between people. In fact, Sissela Bach, she was the wife of Derek Bach, who was the president of Harvard. She was also a scholar in her own right, and she wrote a book called Lying. And she makes the interesting point that liars take advantage of this fact because the only reason that liars can succeed in what they do is because there is a general assumption that when people talk, they're telling the truth. And the liar, he takes advantage of that because he doesn't tell the truth. But if there was no general assumption that people generally tell the truth, then the liar wouldn't be able to lie because no one would believe anyone. It's only the fact that people generally do believe that the liar can take advantage of this. In other words, the liars need the rules of truthfulness so that people can believe their lies. They want to game the system or take advantage of the system. But for their lies to be taken seriously, the rest of society needs to follow the laws of truth. Well, what happens if the word gets out that you cannot trust the rabbi tells you? That even though the rabbi is telling you it's forbidden, it might really be permitted. Well, then the rabbi's authority would be destroyed. Another problem is that how can this approach of the noble lie be countenanced in interactions between scholars? This would go against the whole idea of a noble lie in which the elites have the information. They can handle the truth. To harken back to a movie many of you might have seen. The rabbis can handle the truth. It's the masses that they have to be kept in the dark for their own good. Now, these are points which I discuss in the book. We don't have time for me to go into any more detail now because I want to get to other matters. I can come back to them if anyone has questions, but I discuss them in the book. I want to, though, raise some more issues. But even before going further, from what we have seen, we can fairly say that Judaism, traditional Judaism, has a tradition of lying for the sake of the people. In fact, there was a great rabbi named Aryeh Kaplan. He wrote a number of books on mysticism, on meditation. He brought meditation back into Judaism. A lot of people were going to the Eastern religions trying to meditate and abandoning Judaism. And his argument was that we have medieval Jewish meditation. You don't need to go looking in India. We have meditation. He also wrote 2 volumes of a book called Handbook of Jewish Thought. And it's basically summaries. And after citing these passages, this is what he says, quote, when a rabbi is positive of his conclusions, he may even, if the situation warrants, ascribe the decision to a great sage so that it may be generally accepted. Wow. In the 19th century, there was a rabbi in Budapest named Pest, who in those days was separated, Ramosha Kunitz. He wrote as follows. I'll read it in Hebrew and then translate it to English. Talmid Chacham Rashai Shaker, a scholar is permitted to lie. Laman Hekim Ha'emet Betocho, in order to establish the truth to the extent that's in his power. So the scholar can lie to establish the truth. What type of truth is it if he's lying? But the point is, and then he says that there's a negative commandment in the Torah, though, for the masses to lie, the Am Haaretz. But the rabbis, if they think it's necessary, they can tell a lie. Now, a cynic reading these passages could conclude that one of the functions of a rabbi is to lie for his congregants, that is, for their spiritual well-being. In fact, This is not entirely inaccurate. There is a great dispute that breaks out in the 19th century. I'm sure many of you know that there's two types of laws in Judaism. You have Torah laws and you have rabbinic laws. Laws of the rabbis. And generally, people have always been more careful about laws of the Torah as opposed to laws of the rabbis, even though we're supposed to follow all the laws. What happens if you're in a situation where the people are not following a certain law that's a rabbinic law? Can you tell them it's a Torah law to keep them on the straight and narrow? This is a huge dispute. There's a whole group of authorities who say that the rabbi is allowed to tell the congregants that what they're doing is a violation of Torah law, because after all, why do the masses need to know whether it's Torah or rabbinic? They need to follow the law. But since in their twisted, incorrect approach, they only follow Torah law, so we can tell them it's Torah law. It's like you'll tell your child something. There are other rabbis who disagree, who say, no, this is absolutely forbidden. And in fact, this is a violation of a Torah commandment. The Torah says we can't add on to the Torah. So if you tell someone that this is a Torah law when it's only rabbinic law, you are adding on to the Torah. And this is a big dispute. In fact, this dispute has contemporary relevance. In the 1980s or 90s, there was a big dispute in Orthodox circles about these groups, women's prayer groups, that the women would come together and they would have like a minyan of their own. And you had various rabbis who issued statements, like ex cathedra statements, without just proclamations, basically, that this is forbidden. It goes against Torah law. And there was a lot of discussions. Well, do they really mean Torah law? Because if you look in the Torah, you don't see anything about this. Or were they just using their powers to argue in a polemical fashion, like powers of exaggeration? Okay, let's leave that on the side. Um, there's another sort of falsehood in attribution that's found in rabbinic literature. Here again, there's Talmudic precedent, and there are also great disputes among traditional thinkers. Look, in a secular society, knowledge exists independent of originators. If you have a scoundrel, let's say, who writes a great book or comes up with a great invention, his personal life is irrelevant, as it's the knowledge that's important. I don't even understand why anyone would find ethical problems using Nazi data. Let's say if they engage in all sorts of terrible experiments. If they came up with some scientific truths, I don't see you could object using for utilitarian purposes, and it might lead to all sorts of problems. But the information exists; it's out there. It has its own validity. Doesn't matter who discovered it. But in a religious society, not only is the knowledge important, but the profounder is important. It's often the case that a statement is given authority not because of the statement, but because of the person who said it. In other words, for something to be permitted in Jewish law, it's not enough that someone makes a good argument, a stellar argument even. No, you need the imprimatur of a recognized scholars. Now, these scholars, the great rabbis, they're not like judges. Judges, let's say in America, they have authority by virtue of their positions. But the rabbis, the great rabbis, their position comes from their authority. That is, first they have the authority, then they have the position. And their authority is inextricably linked with the community sense that this person is both pious and learned. In fact, piety is crucial in determining that X is an authority and Y is not. There's lots of learned people. But if they don't have the necessary piety, they're never going to be taken seriously. By the same token, there's lots of pious people, but they need the necessary scholarship to be taken seriously. So when it comes to law, clearly you need someone who's pious and learned for their position to count, to be in the ballpark. But what happens when we move from the area of law to that of interpretation? Let's say a heretic or a sectarian puts forth a brilliant, wonderful interpretation of religious texts that he might not even accept the binding authority of. Already the Talmud speaks of men, quote, men whose waters we drink, but whose names we do not mention. There is an entire tradition in Jewish thinking that assumes that you can use the insights of these people, but their names should not be recited in order that they lose the honor of having been recorded in rabbinic tradition. That's their punishment. Maimonides follows a completely different approach, which also has many important figures who stand by it. He believed in citing the truth from whoever states it. He even says that at times he's not going to cite the name of who the position of the person who cites this idea, but not because as a punishment, because the person's a heretic or anything like that. No, because he says they're foolish people who, if they hear that I'm citing, let's say, a Greek scholar, they won't pay attention because, oh, if he's not a rabbi, what can I learn from him? So, although in Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, he cites the Greek philosophers all the time, in his commentary on the Mishnah, he tells us in one place that he's going to cite, and he has a thing called the Eight Chapters, which is in Pirkei Avot, which he presents all sorts of interesting philosophical ideas. But he says that there are some people when they see a citation, and it's this person offends them, they won't pay attention to it. Therefore, best not to cite the original author. And the original author would, of course, agree that he'd rather his idea get across. It would be like today if, in certain communities, if you cite, let's say, a Christian interpreter of the Torah, people will immediately put it down. They won't. What can you learn from that? So, the Art Scroll Chumash, for instance, will never have any. Not only will they never have any non-Jewish writers, they'll never have any cited. They'll never have any non-Orthodox thinkers. On the contrary, however, on the other hand, look at the Hertz Chumash, the old Hertz Chumash, which cites Christian thinkers and Reform rabbis and everyone, and he justifies this in the introduction by stating that, as Maimonides says, accept the truth from whoever says it. Doesn't matter if it's a non-believer, it doesn't matter. So this is an old dispute. In fact, it's interesting that some people adopt the middle approach. They don't want to cite this heretic, let's say, but they feel they have to somehow give credit. So what they do is they have a system of code in which they would refer to the person, let's say, by the first initials or some other way. Now, since I mentioned Maimonides, let me briefly mention another example of falsehood in writing of Maimonides, and it too relates to what we've seen so far, namely that the absolute truth can be waived occasionally for religious considerations. Now, today I think we live in an era where truth is paramount and everyone we believe should have access to it. But this was not the feeling in medieval times. In medieval times, it was thought that certain truths are dangerous for the masses, and therefore philosophers learned to write in an esoteric fashion. That is, certain truths. Rav Kook writes that you should not say something which is going to negatively affect someone's religious position, even if you know it's true. So, for instance, you don't go into Mea Shearim in Jerusalem and start explaining to them how Torah and evolution could be reconciled. They never heard of Darwin. They don't know anything about this. So, not all truths are for all people. Now, this goes against the grain today, when I think the assumption is that everyone should have all the truths and the idea that you're covering it up. But I think every rabbi knows, for instance, every rabbi knows that when you give a sermon, there's certain things you don't say because not everything's appropriate for everyone to hear. Unlike, for example, if you're having a class, you might discuss more detailed controversial matters, and we don't say everything to our children that we'll say to our colleagues. And this was a common idea in medieval times as well. So, as I said, philosophers learned to write in an esoteric fashion. That is, so that not everyone would grasp what they're saying, only other philosophers. Maimonides does the same thing. In the introduction to his Guide to the Perplexed, he tells us that because he doesn't want everyone to grasp his teachings, his hidden teachings, that's what they are, he's going to getting some noise on my other computer, so I'm not pausing that. Maimonides tells us he's going to write in a certain fashion, and he's going to write things, and then he's going to say things elsewhere that contradict what he originally wrote. And the contradiction is going to be such that most people, that is the masses, they will not even see the contradiction. But the intellectuals, the elites, they will see that he contradicts himself, and they will draw the right conclusion. That is, that they'll see that in one place Maimonides says one thing, in another place he contradicts it, and they'll understand, presumably, the more radical view is his true view, even though the contradiction is not necessarily apparent. And this is a common philosophical approach, although both Aquinas and Kant disagreed with the notion that a lie can never be permissible. I think maybe Maimonides would say he's not actually lying here. He's just putting out false statements. I don't know if you can make a distinction here, but Maimonides is explicit. There are things he writes in the guide that are not correct, or at the very least, some have interpreted they're correct in one way, but not in another way. So, for instance, the Torah. The Torah says that God gets angry. It speaks of God's anger, but God doesn't have anger. He doesn't have emotions. So it's not true, but in a factual sense, but God responds in a way that if he was a human and he was angry, he'd respond that sort of way. So there's some aspect of truth with falsehood. So that's Maimonides' approach. How about truth telling in normal interactions? The Torah tells us, "Midavar sheker tirchak," keep far from a false matter. Although if you look in the Torah, the context is legalistic. That is, don't lie in court or the like. Similarly, by the way, when they talk about take the Lord's name in vain, what does that mean? I mean, it's usually understood in like court cases or things we have to take an oath with God's name. Uh, so although midvar sheker tircha, keep far from a false matter, has usually been understood in I mean, classically in a legalistic context, don't lie in court or the like, many authorities have also understood it in a more expansive sense. While Jewish sources never had as uncompromising a view regarding lying as Catholic thinkers or Kant, there is agreement that barring serious reason, one must tell the truth. Now, I mean, Kant, a great, great philosopher, but he says something that from our perspective is just insane. I mean, Kant has this idea of categorical imperative that you must always do the right thing no matter the circumstances. So if someone comes to your house and he's looking to kill another person, and this person's hiding in your house, and the murderers, or the ones who want to be murderers, come to your house and say, "Is John Doe in your house?" You cannot lie and say, "No, he is not." You must speak the truth. Now, you don't have to say, "Yes, he's here." You could speak in equivocal language, we call it. Like you could answer the question, "Is John Doe in the house?" by saying, "I saw John Doe here earlier today." And the person on his own would conclude, "Well, you must be mean. He was here earlier today. He's no longer here," even though that's not your intention. But Kant and Aquinas as well says you can't actually lie and say, "No, he is not here today." We, of course, have never accepted this approach. On the contrary, you're obligated to lie to save a life. And according to Jewish law, barring serious reasons, we must tell the truth. That's how Jewish thinkers have understood this passage, midvar sheker tirchak. But barring serious reason, there's the rub. It's precisely because Judaism does not insist on complete truthfulness that the door to prevarication has been opened. And let me explain. There's a famous argument in the Talmud, Tractate Ketubot 16b, between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, the two great schools in Tannaitic times, about praising a bride as looking beautiful. Um, we're told that you're supposed to praise the bride, say she's beautiful. Um, Beit Shammai says Beit Hillel says you praise every bride. It doesn't matter if she's beautiful or not. You say she's beautiful um, because that's what we do, so that she feels good. Kavod Abriot, it's called. Beit Shammai says no. We only can speak the truth. So it's not that he would say you have to say she's not beautiful. You could say you praise those aspects of her that you can be truthful about, or you can say she's a beautiful person. But Beit Hillel says no. You can bend the truth, tell a lie for the larger purpose. And everyone knows that we always hold like Beit Hillel. And this allows us to live our lives with common sense. Can you imagine if we held like Beit Shammai? And every time you were given a gift and you planned on returning it the next day, you had to tell someone, "Oh, Yeah, well, thanks for the gift. I really don't like it. I'm returning it tomorrow. Or if your wife gets a new haircut and asks you how you like it, if you have to tell her the truth, if you don't like it, or a new dress. I mean, can you imagine if we actually had to always speak the truth? And sometimes you can't be equivocal. If someone asks you straight out, did so and so say something bad about me? And you actually have to say, yes, he did. I mean, sometimes you can't get around it. It would be very difficult to live in this world. So it's good that we follow Beit Hillel and we see that there is a heter, there is a permission, not just a permission, an obligation at times for telling white lies for the greater good. By the way, I don't need a Talmudic passage to tell us that we don't need to tell the whole truth for the greater good. That's already in the Torah, if you recall. When God appears to Abraham, he um, he tells him he's going to have a child. Sarah hears this, and what does Sarah say? How can I have a child? I'm old, and my husband's old. When the text reports that God repeats this to Abraham, what does he say? That Sarah says, "How can I have a child when I'm old?" Well, he left out an important point, namely that Sarah didn't just say I'm old. Sarah also said my husband's old. And this is given an example of saying that sometimes you don't need to tell the whole truth. We can, if someone says, an example I give sometimes, if someone asks, a girl asks you, if a guy says about this girl, she's pretty stupid. And so she asks you, did he say anything about me? You can say, yes, he said you're pretty. We're allowed to leave things out. Um, Someone says he's a good guy to kick around. You can say, oh, he said you're a good guy. Yeah. We don't need to tell the whole truth always. Already the Torah shows us that in terms of not always telling the truth as well, the Talmud describes Aaron is supposed to be a great peacemaker. Husband and wife would get in a dispute. They portray him this way. It doesn't mean this actually happened, but this is how they imagine Aaron. And the more important thing is not what Aaron did as portraying Aaron. So we take the lesson that Aaron would go to the husband and say to the husband, you're she wants to apologize. She wants to make up. You should meet her halfway. And he go to the wife and say, he's really upset. He tried to bring them together, even if the husband and wife never said this and didn't have that feeling. But in order to make shalom bayit, peace in the house, so we can do these things. I want to conclude with two examples of how the issues we have been discussing played out in the real world. Actually, before I even give you the two examples that I discussed in the book, I'll just give you another example before we get to that I heard from a rabbi was asked. I don't want to mention his name because maybe he doesn't want it to be mentioned, but he's a well-known halachic authority. And people are always calling him up with questions, as you can imagine, questions of Jewish law. So he told someone that someone asked him a similar question and he about his own circumstance and he reflected on what he does. Namely, if someone calls up and asks, "Can I speak to Rabbi so and so?" He said it's permissible for the person who answers the phone, let's say his wife, to say that Rabbi so and so is not available now, Rabbi so and so is not here now, or something like that. The people calling don't have the right to this information. If you don't want to always say, what are you going to say? That right now he's here, but he's busy. He's not going to, you don't always want to say constantly he's busy. So you can say he's not available or he's not home or something, and that would be considered okay. But I want to give you two examples I discuss in the book, which show how this is relevant. There was a rabbi in the mid 20th century in New York. His name was Eliyahu Elijah Russoff. He's not exactly one of the great figures that we remember today, but in his day, he was a halachic authority in New York, and he wrote a volume of responsa. Now, the mid 20th century was a period when even many Jews who were not that observant attended traditional synagogues. And it was also a time that, and I think this is still the situation in many parts of America, probably, that sitting shiva was viewed as like the ultimate in observance, and the Sabbath was not as important. People went to work. They maybe went to synagogue on Saturday morning, but then they went to work. Now, really, according to Jewish law, the Sabbath is more important than Shiva. Sabbath is from the Torah, but you can see that the Sabbath comes every week. But Shiva doesn't come that often, so people take it more seriously. Now, one of the congregants, this is the case he describes in the book. One of his congregants was sitting Shiva, and the last day of his Shiva was the Sabbath. Well, the we know that with Shiva, the final day is an abridged day. You know, you wake up in the morning and you spend there's a little Shiva in the morning. After you have the davening and then the prayers, and then a little bit after that, and then the Shiva ends. So if the final day was Saturday morning, the Shiva would end Saturday morning, and then the person could do what he wants. The person, this is a simple Jew in New York, asked the rabbi if the seventh day does he need to sit Shiva. Now, why is he asking this question? He explained why he's asking this question because although he's been sitting Shiva, and his wife has been minding the store. And I guess she wasn't doing a good job about it, and he's anxious to get back because they're losing all this money. Now, although the Sabbath is more important than Shiva, as I said, in the popular imagination, this was not the case. And here's a person who every week would go to a store on Saturday. So now he's asking the rabbi, do I have to sit Shiva on Saturday? Because if not, I'm going to go to the store. So the rabbi discusses the question, do I tell the man the truth? Now, the question, by the way, today would be unimaginable because anyone can go to the internet, find out this information. Information's out there. But think back to this is probably the 1920s or 30s, a much more simple time when you ask the rabbi, and that's where you get the answer, and you're very trusting, unlike today. And it's not like the Rabbi Russoff will tell him something, and then the person will find out later something else. It's just that wasn't the situation. So he has a whole discussion there. So should I tell him the truth? On the one hand, he asked the question. So shouldn't I tell him the truth? The truth is that the shiv is over. On the other hand, if I tell him the truth, he's going to violate the Sabbath. And Jews believe that they have a responsibility for others. And if we can prevent someone from violating the Sabbath, we should. So what he asks, what should I do? Now, after what we have seen so far, I don't think it's going to surprise you if I tell you that he lied to the man, telling him that while he can wear regular shoes and the like, he can't leave the house, just like if he was sitting Shiva. Now, I have no doubt that no rabbi today would give such an answer, but as I said, in an era when people were more trusting and when information was not readily available like it is today, I don't think it's surprising that a rabbi would adopt a paternalistic attitude and provide false information for the congregant's own good. I think the parallel is the old practice of doctors having a paternalistic approach and not letting patients have complete knowledge of their conditions. Until the second half of the 20th century, they instituted a Patient's Bill of Rights, but philosophers often regarded a physician's withholding a fatal diagnosis from a patient as an exception to general precepts of truth. They regarded the distress that the patient would receive from this bad news as sufficiently harmful to outweigh the presumption favoring disclosure. And this was standard, that doctors would not reveal fatal diagnoses. And it was attitudes such as this that led to the Patient's Bill of Rights that was adopted by the American Hospital Association in 1973. Rabbis have always viewed themselves as doctors, I guess, doctors of souls. And here we have a perfect example of not telling the truth for a higher goal. And the higher goal was not some societal need, it's intended to keep a Jew from sinning. The fact that the person does not know what's going on is irrelevant, since sins are thought to be a negative force whether or not someone realizes it. It's the rabbi's job, so he thought, to do what he can to prevent sin. There was a rabbi in Tel Aviv. His name was Chaim David Halevi, and he said that all these sorts of arguments, these paternalistic approaches, we don't tell the people the whole truth in order that they not sin. He says it doesn't apply anymore today. He says and he was writing this before the internet. He died, I think, in the 1990s, so before the internet. But since we have so much information, you can't have a rabbi saying things that can easily be found out to be not true, because then people will lose all respect, because when they ask the rabbi a question, they expect that his answer is going to be what the law is, not that he's giving him stringencies and extra things. So Rabbi Halevi says that today the rabbi has to only give absolute truth. I want to give you another example that happened in a community that I know, because I was told this by one of the rabbis involved. There was a rabbinic board of all the local towns, and he was on it, and he told me about this. So in certain Orthodox communities, the rabbis feel that there's a problem with ball games on the Sabbath. Now, there's an eruv, so people can carry, but they're not technically forbidden, but they go against the spirit of the Sabbath. Um, they feel. One of the rabbis in this town wanted to tell the congregants that it was forbidden to play ball on the Sabbath. Just make a statement. It was forbidden to play ball. He thought that this was within his rights as a rabbi, as we've seen, to maybe, I don't know if distort is too strong a word, but not be completely straight with Jewish law in the name of a larger goal. Why do I say not to be completely straight? Because Ramosha Isserlis, the Ashkenazic Shulchan Aruch, says explicitly that you can play ball on the Sabbath. So now, yes, so what was Rabbi Isserlis referring to? He might be referring to a little catch or something like that. He wasn't referring to, 3-on-3 basketball game in the summer where everyone's getting sweaty and they're wearing shorts and all that. You could easily see that that's not the Shabbat spirit. On the other hand, does that give the rabbi a right to then just make a blanket declaration that it's forbidden? Well, the rabbi thought that he could because the people were destroying the spirit of the Sabbath. And therefore, he wanted to tell them it's forbidden. Well, the other rabbi, the rabbi who told me the story, said to him that you can't tell people that it's forbidden to play ball on the Sabbath. And if he does that, this rabbi, who apparently didn't have a good relationship with the other rabbi, said, I'm going to tell the people that they're allowed to play ball on the Sabbath because there is no legal prohibition. Instead, you have to be honest with the lay people and show them that although playing ball is permitted, it is not the Sabbath spirit to play ball the way you are playing ball. There's a big difference between going outside and just taking some shots at the hoop basketball as a form of relaxation, which is permissible, and even in the Shabbos spirit, you could say, versus the sort of games, even baseball games they were having in this town on the Sabbath. That's what you need to do. And this dispute between those two rabbis goes back to the 19th century. And I mentioned this already. The idea is, can you, quote, raise the level of a prohibition to keep people in mind, keep people in line? Can you tell people that something is a Torah prohibition when it's only rabbinic prohibition? And I have to tell you that this is a dispute with great rabbis on both sides of the issue. As I mentioned, Rabbi Chaim David Halevi says today it's an irrelevant dispute because everyone has to acknowledge that today you have to be honest with the people because they will find out the truth one way or the other. What I tried to show in my book, Changing the Immutable, which is mainly focused on historical portrayals and traditional works, censorship and the like, is that the traditional Jewish society, which puts such a stress on truth. Let me show you, by the way, the symbol, the crest, as it were, of my children's school. Well, now they graduated, but the one they were in for many years, here it is. And these are we put on our car, the magnet. This is the Kushner School in Livingston, New Jersey. The truth and nothing but the truth. That's the symbol they put. I mean, we think about when we take an oath, like for courts, right? The truth. Um, what do we say? The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So I don't know if we can read something into this that it says the truth and nothing but the truth, but doesn't say the whole truth. I don't think so. I think maybe they couldn't fit in the whole truth. So they just abridged that. But it says the truth and nothing but the truth. And that is good Jewish values. And that's, I think, the Jewish approach that most of us are most comfortable with. And really try to, have our lives, this is like the lodestar of our lives, to follow truth. However, we have to be honest and acknowledge that the tradition also developed something akin to the noble lie that Not only are there times I mentioned where we don't believe you always have to tell the truth, if it's going to hurt someone's feelings, if it's going to create various problems that we recognize, there are times when you don't need to tell the truth. There are passages in the Talmud, very troubling passages for a modern person, that seem to countenance not telling the truth in order to keep people in line from a Jewish law perspective. Yes, there are passages that contradict this. And the passages that contradict this are the ones that most of us, I think, are more attuned in line with. However, if we want to be honest, I think we have to acknowledge that this is a complicated tradition, and you have both approaches in the Talmud. In fact, Art Scroll, as I mentioned, doesn't seem to have any problem. It presents both approaches, including the approach that countenances falsehoods. Whereas my experiences in the modern Orthodox world, that's the approach that people find very problematic and don't know what to do with it. I don't necessarily have the answers to what to do with this, but I think we need to be honest and recognize that we do not have a tradition like the Catholic tradition where it's all truth all the time. But matters get much more complicated, and precisely because the Talmud already says that you're allowed to shade the truth or tell a white lie for certain important purposes, then it becomes a dispute. What's the definition of an important purpose? If to prevent people from violating the Sabbath for Rabbi Rusov, that is an important purpose. And I could go on, but I think I've spoken long enough. And I will take the questions, although at the moment I only see one question. Hillel asked, did a matriarch lie to one of the patriarchs so as to maintain the peace within the household? Well, I think if you look at the story with Yitzchak and Rivka, when Rivka sends Yaakov in there to get the blessings, I think you can make the case there that she was involved in a falsehood, and we know that what we call peace within the household, shalom bayit, that's one of the examples given that you can tell a falsehood. Um, Again, it's hard to make hard and fast rules because sometimes you're doing it to spare your own skin, and it's not really for shalom bayit. But at least in theory, it is permissible to spare someone's feelings, to spare someone from hurt. The old question is, what about a white lie? I mean, is that really when the rabbi said that you need to tell the truth today? What is a white lie? A white lie is a false that doesn't have any significance. You stopped off on the way home to to pick up a newspaper, and you arrive home 5 minutes later, and your wife says, I expect you earlier. Did you stop anywhere? And you say, or no, or you say, I came home straight home. I didn't, the sort of thing. And obviously, if you stop to get her flowers, you're allowed to say that, no, I didn't stop at all. We understand this. So um, it's problematic though, because where to draw the line? Once I tell you that you can say that every bride is beautiful, even if you don't think so, where do you put the red line there? Incidentally, some rabbis, we see that some more recent, if you look in the early commentaries on the Talmud, they understand it to mean simply that you can say a lie. You don't think she's beautiful, you can say she's beautiful because you don't want to hurt her feelings. And there's other examples in the Talmud that you can praise someone's item even if you don't think so because you don't want to hurt their feelings. But later commentators seem to have a problem with this. Why do I say this? Because you look at how they reinterpret the passage. When they say that you could say that a bride is beautiful, even if not, they say that, well, the husband must think she's beautiful because he's marrying her. So therefore, when you say she's beautiful, you really mean that the husband thinks she's beautiful. But that's not how the earlier authorities understand it. They understand it that sometimes that we have certain values that are regarded as more important than simply telling the truth. And you have these other sort of justifications, which shows you that the more recent commentators were struggling over this, and they were reluctant to have a hard and fast rule that you can tell a falsehood in the name of a larger good. But as I said, the early commentators see this as a given, as far as I can see. Uh, the Rabbi Wan mentions truth from all sources. How do you see this view in the observant Jewish world? I think it's depends which part of the observant Jewish world. The more right-wing world, will never cite from Christian thinkers or from liberal Jewish thinkers. They won't even cite from Orthodox thinkers who are not as observant as they should be. So, for example, Rav Kook, Rav Soloveitchik, they won't cite them. In fact, I still remember I had, in my youth, I had more of a right-wing education. And I think maybe I mentioned it or one of my friends that a Christian thinker said something, and the rabbi said, well, if a Christian said it, how could it be true? And as I learned more, I realized that this is obviously not the approach of Maimonides and many of the others. The Abarbanel, the famous Abarbanel, cites Christian thinkers. And he said, because the whole point is, and many do, that if you take the truth from wherever it comes, and everyone can have good insights. And that's Maimonides' approach. And that's really the only, I guess you would say, sophisticated intellectual approach. Because how can you say, as a priori, that only someone in my camp could have a correct insight about these matters? It doesn't work for people who have um, I, when I say sophisticated, maybe that's the wrong word, but a certainly an enlightened view of how knowledge works. Let's put it that way.
Do we have any more questions that anyone would like to pose?
I'll just add one more thing that your rabbi has written. He sent it to me. Beautiful writings on the conversos and their whole experience. And I mean, they had to live this double life that he writes about, and no one would ever imagine that that to lie, to save your life, to be able to practice Judaism, that's creating a problem. The problem might be, if you're that you violate certain prohibitions in worshiping Christianity, but the idea to lie to save your life, and I mean, it, Jews have always understood this. This is a basic principle. Only for three things do we give up our life for. When you read the Catholic thinkers, and they're in Aquinas, and they're understanding, not just Aquinas, Augustine also, and their understanding of truth, it blows us away. And by the way, the whole idea, and because they are so uncompromising, something had to give. And therefore, you have this whole doctrine in Catholicism. The Jesuits were involved with this, called mental reserve. That's when you see oaths, when people say, I take an oath with no mental reserve. I mean, the Jesuits developed this doctrine, or some of them, that you could take an oath and you say, for instance, I was not here, but in your mind you have saying, I was not here today, but I was here yesterday. I mean, all these sort of mental reserves, which in Judaism we didn't need to develop these things, because at times you need to there are times you don't tell the truth to save your life or to spare people's feelings, etc. But there's a whole interesting tradition in the Catholic world, because they had, on the one hand, were so uncompromising. How do you live in the real world? And they developed this whole idea of mental reserve and equivocal language, which again would strike us as so strange and against the common sense. Um, okay, Tyler has a question, or Tyler. Do I think there will still be any place for this attitude from rabbis at all now that the internet is a prominent, as you mentioned? No, I think, as Rabbi Halevi already mentioned, even in the 90s, before the internet, this idea that you can cover up things, that you can give different answers to different people. I mean, it doesn't work anymore today because the knowledge is out there. And what he said, which I think we have to multiply it many times, is now when the rabbis are asked a question, they have to honestly answer it. Also, the questioners are more sophisticated. You have to explain to them, and sometimes it's not so simple. It's much easier to say it's forbidden, but sometimes you need to explain that technically it's permitted, but it's not going to be good for our community. It just means the rabbi and the congregants need to be operating at a more sophisticated level. But we are more sophisticated. We're college educated. If we're not college educated, we're aware of many more things. It's very hard to compare societies today with what they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Remember, they used to go to the rabbi for everything. My grandmother remembers, she grew up on the east side. She grew up, sorry, not on the east side, in Brownsville. Rabbi Rousseff, I think, was on the east side, but the same type of, same era, and the same type of East European Jewish background. She told me that her mother, so she was born in 1910, so her mother's earlier, when they didn't know from psychologists. If there was an issue, they went to the rabbi. If they have a bad dream, they went to the rabbi. If there's a marital problem, they went to the rabbi. So that this idea of the rabbi and the lack of the sort of knowledge that we have today in our synagogues, you are fortunate if the rabbi knows the most Torah in the synagogue. But there's no assumption that because sometimes you have people in the synagogue who are very learned and more learned than rabbis, or they are rabbis, but they're not the functioning rabbi. And every synagogue, we have people who are experts in math, in medicine, in science, and everything. That's our synagogues. That's our communities. Compare that to 100 years ago when the rabbi just wasn't the expert in Torah. He knew more than everyone in basically everything because the people at age 12 all went to work and, so they didn't have any education. Only the rabbi did. So it's a very different era, and it's much harder for the rabbis, by the way, because they need to be on top of their game much more than it used to be. You can't just tell people anything you want because the people are going to go to the internet and they're going to come back and say, what about, so it's they really it forces, but again, I guess it's good. It competition forces us to raise our game. And you ask, what should be our attitude if a lie is uncovered and the actual truth causes emotional pain? It's a tough situation, and it's hard to know. And every case is so different, and there are sometimes the people who have the truth have to reveal it because there's some scandal going on, and there's other times they might feel that if it doesn't affect the community, it's just a familial thing, that it's okay to keep it hidden. Now, the problem is that has backfired sometimes, and these are very difficult problems. I don't even pretend to know. There's a commentary on the Talmud. It's called Tosfot. So in yeshiva, there was an expression that the questions of Tosfot are often better than the answers. The questions here, the things, the issues I've raised, really are very difficult. I don't have the answers, and these are things to struggle with. And but I think the upshot is that again, that there's two traditions here, and there are times when absolute truth is not called for. Look, with our children, we don't always tell them the absolute truth. We recognize that we might tell them that crime doesn't pay, and they get older, they realize that for some people, unfortunately, it does. But we try to, give them values, and it's tough to draw the line, so it's complicated. So I'll leave it at that. This is a tough, interesting. Your rabbi obviously thinks that he thinks you're a very challenging group because he wanted me to speak on this topic. It's a complicated topic.
Well, let me say that I just a wonderful presentation. I think that one of the things that I have tried to communicate to our synagogue is this approach of knowledge from any source,
Yeah.
appreciating it, evaluating it. Doesn't mean that you endorse it, but just being able to scrutinize and understand. We live in a complex world. We don't live on the shtetl or in a very limited society. We live in a very open society. So just finding people like yourself. I'm so appreciative of the connection with Rabbi Avi Hoffman. That that just this is the kind of rabbis I had when I was studying at Spertus and in the different programs I was in. They're very erudite, very well read, and they had no
Well,
problems
thank you.
quoting from different sources without any issue. And that's I love that. So thank you so
Thank you.
much.
And thank you, Stephen. And thank you all for coming out. Very nice crowd for Sunday night. Okay.
Yes, and there's plenty more. I'm sure they'll see it online, and we appreciate
Yeah.
that opportunity
Maybe
to
one
share it.
day we'll meet in person, God willing.
Bezrat Hashem, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so
Okay.
much, Rabbi.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.